It was just a few days after Abraham Lincoln had won the 1860 presidential election that political prognosticators around the country began to postulate about who the new president would choose for the all-important seats in his cabinet. The papers wondered who would become Secretary of State. They bandied lists of names that might soon belong to the Attorney General. They debated who should be Lincoln's Secretary of War, and they worried that the choice would become more consequential than anyone could have ever hoped. There were names that popped up time and again: Lincoln's Republican rivals, William Seward, Salmon Chase, Edward Bates. The press assumed these would each be given a prominent role, but depending on which paper you read, they played a kind of musical chairs with the seat they would hold. To hear the newspapermen tell it, even though they were all just guessing, there was more uncertainty than not in what would become President Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, except for in one position. It was widely assumed and assured that South Bend's Schuyler Colfax would be named Postmaster General. The New York Herald called it a foregone conclusion, and Colfax himself seemed to be excited about the inevitability, keeping a collection of newspaper clippings published in the weeks after the election whenever those editors mentioned Colfax's name in connection with the role of Postmaster General. In some ways, Colfax seemed to be on the brink of the culmination of a career at just 37 years old. Colfax's earliest working experiences came when he ran his stepfather's general store in New Carlisle, a place that just so happened to double as the young town's first post office. Colfax's first known letter to a political figure was written to the Postmaster General when Colfax was just a teenager. He proposed a list of postal reforms based largely on his experience at the post office. As the calendar turned into 1860, Representative Colfax had just served as chair of the House Committee on Postal Affairs and had been instrumental in passing reform and expanding postal service into the New West. Besides that, he was a beloved and prominent Republican with 3 congressional terms under his belt. A promotion to the president's cabinet was the logical next step. Now, there's something you should know about the Postmaster General. It was a much more prestigious position in 1860 than it is now, and it would have been quite an impressive story for the local hero from South Bend to have ascended to such a high office. But it wasn't prestigious enough that we would have done 8 podcast episodes 160 years later about Schuyler Colfax, 20th Postmaster General of the United States of America. In the end, Colfax was not selected to the position, and he was not given a place in Lincoln's cabinet at all. This shocked political insiders and outsiders, and seems to have come as quite the surprise to Schuyler Colfax himself. Colfax ruminated on the slight, wondered if he'd done anything to draw Lincoln's ire, remembered that he'd been publicly impartial during the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, and he wondered if maybe that had something to do with it. At least that's what he wrote in a letter to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln responded with haste to Colfax's concerns just a few days after the 1861 inauguration, assuring Colfax that there was no ill will and no hard feelings. Lincoln gushed about Colfax as a young man with a brilliant career who had a bright future ahead of him, and begged, he used the word beg, that Colfax would not consider for a second that Lincoln held the Indiana representative in anything like contempt or malice. The letter illustrates the esteem that Lincoln found in either his personal relationship with Colfax, or at least the value he saw in the political cooperation the two would need to strike. It's at least somewhat remarkable that Lincoln wrote the letter at all. He had plenty more on his to-do list. He'd been president for 4 days. 7 states had already seceded. As Lincoln settled into the White House, and as Colfax started on his 4th term in Congress, they were both about to be in the middle of a nation reshaped by violence and bloodshed. Hurt feelings didn't matter anymore. It was time to get to work. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, And during this series, we are going to dive into the life of South Bend's own Schuyler Colfax. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the Civil War. It's a story you know, one you've been taught again and again, so I don't really want to rehash all of the details. There are plenty of other podcasts that will do that better than I could. Instead, we are going to focus on Schuyler Colfax's place right in the middle of it, and we'll start with his own words, written on the pages of the St. Joseph Valley Register on April 18th, 1861. The die is cast. South Carolina has courted the glory of lighting the torch of civil war. Forbearance on the part of the national government has been met with arrogance and insult until, unable to force the United States into any act of bloodshed and violence which they could make a pretext for their act, they have most wickedly precipitated the Republic into war. They have opened the fire of their murderous batteries on the flag that Washington loved, and which Jackson, Taylor, and Scott illuminated with so many glorious triumphs, a parricidal act as infamous as the ruffian who aims a death blow at the mother who had borne and nurtured him. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Congress changed overnight. One by one, Southern states seceded from the Union, and their representatives packed up and left Washington. The result? A smaller, but far less divided Congress. For years, the North and South had been locked in a bitter political standoff, but now, with Southern lawmakers gone, the Republicans had breathing room. The new 37th Congress was smaller, but far more unified, and Schuyler Colfax, now a respected political veteran in his fourth term, found himself with a louder voice than ever before. Colfax was no firebrand. He hated slavery, but at first he hated disunion more. Like many Republicans, he was willing to tolerate slavery where it already existed, so long as it never expanded another inch. But as the weeks turned into months, Colfax realized with creeping horror the truth that other Republicans had resigned themselves to. There would be no compromise. The firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861 and Lincoln's subsequent call for troops transformed the political crisis into a real actual war. It was happening. Buildings were burning, people were dying, and the only way to end it was to win. As the war dragged on, Colfax, like many in the Republican Party, began to see that the Union couldn't be saved unless slavery was confronted. From the floor of the House, Colfax shared the finality of the situation they found themselves in. The South may have initiated this revolution to protect slavery, but the North will finish it to preserve the Union, and perhaps in doing so, we may destroy both. In the meantime, there was work to do. Colfax was named again the chair of the House Committee on Post Offices and Roads, which, again, was far more prestigious than it sounds. Reliable communication across a fractured country was a lifeline. Colfax helped secure mail routes to Union troops in the field, supported new infrastructure in the West, and made sure the public stayed informed during a time when every letter, every newspaper, and every message mattered. And that brings us to one of the biggest pieces of legislation Colfax supported during the war, the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. It authorized a transcontinental railroad, a dream project that had been stuck in political limbo for years, blocked by Southern opposition. Now, with the South gone, the road was clear. For Colfax, the railroad was a chance to think and dream beyond the end of the Civil War. He believed the conflict would end, and when it did, America would need to be stronger and more connected than ever before. A transcontinental railroad would bind east to west and ensure that the future of the country, especially the western frontier, belonged to free men, not slave owners. He said as much in speeches and writings at the time. He saw the railroad as the spine of a new nation. It would carry settlers, ideas, mail, and eventually prosperity. Colfax also backed the Homestead Act, passed on May 20th, 1862, which gave land to small farmers willing to work it. Again, it was about shaping the West around freedom, not servitude. Throughout it all, he remained close to Lincoln's inner circle and allied himself with rising Republican stars like Thaddeus Stevens and William Henry Seward, although he wasn't quite as radical in his views as either of those. Colfax didn't write the boldest laws or shout the loudest speeches, but his fingerprints were everywhere, in the infrastructure, in the vision, in the quiet but firm decisions that helped turn wartime urgency into long-term national growth. He had missed out on the cabinet role he wanted, Postmaster General, but by the time the war reached its second year, it was clear. Colfax didn't need a title to lead. That didn't mean they weren't going to give him one anyway. When we get back from the break, Schuyler Colfax becomes Speaker of the House.
Visit J.G. Bartlett's Bakery at the corner of Washington and Michigan Streets for the best bread, cake, pies, and cheese in South Bend. And now, Mr. Bartlett has invested in a state-of-the-art cracker press. Never had a cracker before? Stop on down to Bartlett's and discover what you're missing. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
When the 38th Congress entered into session on December 7, 1863, there were only two serious candidates for the speakership. The first was Elihu Washburn of Illinois, the longest-serving member of the House. The second was Schuyler Colfax, now serving his fifth term out of South Bend. There was a fair case to be made for each, and behind closed doors plenty of cases were made for both. But when it came time for the official proceedings, it was Washburn who stepped first to the podium and nominated Colfax for the role. Schuyler Colfax was the unanimous selection of his party, and he accepted the honor to the cheers and applause of his peers. Congratulations poured in from across the country, from national newspaper editors, from fellow Republicans, even from friendly Northern Democrats. During those midterm years between the presidential elections, there was no greater honor that could be won than to become the Speaker of the House. For any other politician in any other year, it would have been an overwhelmingly fantastic moment, one to celebrate and remember and savor. But Colfax wasn't just any other politician, and especially for him, this wasn't just any other year. The Civil War was raging. More than 500,000 people were dead from it. July of 1863 had brought the horrors of Gettysburg, remembered now for one of history's greatest speeches and the turning point of the war, but remembered then for more bloodshed in one location than anyone had previously imagined. To celebrate anything too heartily in such fraught times seemed uncouth. And anyway, for his part, Colfax wasn't in much of a celebratory mood. A week after Gettysburg, on July 10, 1863, Colfax's wife, Evelyn Clark Colfax, died. She was just 36. The pair had been married nearly 20 years. Evelyn had been ailing for a while, and her demise was perhaps unsurprising, but for a time, it left Schuyler Colfax rudderless. He'd endured a summer and a fall before the 38th Congress convened, and for the first time he didn't return to South Bend for the summer recess. He wrote his own mother, "I do not think I will be able to come home for some time. I cannot leave town so long yet. Time seems to increase my troubles instead of assuaging them. The busy whirl of fall and winter my mind will be relieved, too much I fear, and now I wish to live amid the ruins of the past, while I can." It's a remarkably vulnerable snapshot. Schuyler Colfax alone in Washington, fully aware that the demands of the times in which he lives will soon enough distract him from his grief, but not yet ready to forget how much it hurts. Fewer than 6 months later, on December 7th, 1863, he was in the Speaker's chair, and he was the one who held the gavel, the most important man, in the most important legislative body in the country, during the most important crisis the nation had ever faced. During his first term as Speaker, Colfax presided over one of the most consequential Congresses in U.S. history. The 38th Congress passed a flood of wartime legislation. Some of it continued the work Colfax had supported during the last session, like infrastructure, taxation, and Western development, but now the legislation had a sharper edge. Slow and methodical action was usually the work of the House, but slow and deliberate debate wasn't going to win the war, and it probably wasn't going to help put the nation back together afterward either. It was this second part that Colfax was most interested in. The war would end, the North would triumph, the seceded states would return, and the biggest question for the Congress was the terms under which they'd be allowed to come back in. The Republicans in the House and the Republican in the White House usually saw eye to eye, but not on this issue. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was pretty forgiving. He proposed that if just 10% of a state's voters promised to be loyal to the Union and accept the end of slavery, that state could start rebuilding its government. It was simple and quick. Lincoln believed in malice toward none, hoping to bring the country back together quickly and avoid prolonged Southern resentment. But not everyone thought that was a good idea. Enter the Wade-Davis bill, backed by some of the most powerful Republicans in Congress, including Schuyler Colfax. They said Lincoln's bill was way too soft. They wanted the South to prove it had changed. Their bill demanded that a majority of white men in each former Confederate state, not just Lincoln's 10%, swear they had never supported the Confederacy. Only then could that state start the process of returning to the Union. In short, Lincoln wanted quick forgiveness. Wade and Davis wanted tough love. The bill passed both houses of Congress on July 2, 1864, but Lincoln, believing it would make peace harder, refused to sign it. That killed the bill and caused a major rift between Congress and the president that would only grow wider after the war. Colfax was also instrumental in championing the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau was created in March 1865 to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom in the chaotic aftermath of the Civil War. It was one of the most ambitious social programs the federal government had ever attempted. The Bureau provided food, shelter, education, and legal help to millions of freed Black Americans and poor whites in the South. It also helped reunite families separated by slavery and war. For Colfax and many in Congress, the Freedmen's Bureau was a necessary step, not just for healing the country, but for making sure that freedom actually meant something. It wasn't perfect, and it faced fierce resistance, but it was a bold attempt to make the promise of emancipation real. But the crown jewel of Colfax's legislative victories came with the 13th Amendment. On January 31st, 1865, after months of fierce debate and political maneuvering, the House of Representatives voted to abolish slavery in the United States. The measure had already gotten through the Senate, but getting it through the House required a full-court press from the Republicans and from Colfax himself. Sending the amendment onto the states required a 2/3 majority, and even with Southern Democrats out of the picture, legislative success was far from a guarantee. Colfax needed to pull every political string at his disposal, carefully winning over holdout moderates and even a few friendly Democrats. It is impossible to overstate Colfax's role in the passage of the landmark amendment. As Speaker, it was his job to be certain of the thing's success before he called it to a vote. At last he did, and when the final tally was read, 119 to 56, cheers erupted in the chamber. The amendment had gotten through by just 4 votes. Colfax himself had cast one of them, breaking a traditionally held taboo that the Speaker should only cast a vote to break a tie. But for Schuyler Colfax, the moment was too big to miss, and he wrote, "I would not have missed recording my vote for the great measure of freedom for all the honors of a dozen speakerships. It's a good thing they got the measure through when they did. The end of the war was just a few months away, and the southern states would begin petitioning for their re-entry into the Union shortly after that." Schuyler Colfax, more than anyone else not named Abraham Lincoln, was responsible for the process that would allow that to happen. The turmoil wasn't over yet, but for a moment there it seemed like its end was in sight. And then, the president was shot. Schuyler Colfax reacts when we get back from the break.
For years, you've known Wurtz and Bernhard as the best wheelsmiths in the county, and now they're producing a full line of wagons and carriages at their manufactory at the northwest corner of Lafayette and Water Street. Wurtz and Bernhard may be the newest names in South Bend's carriage industry, but soon enough they'll be the biggest, and you'll want to say you shopped there first. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
It's April 13th, 1865, and Schuyler Colfax is in the midst of a very long meeting with the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. They speak about a great many things, Reconstruction and Western expansion among them. Schuyler Colfax is preparing a trip for the West, and Lincoln wants to send along a special message for the miners extracting treasures from the earth. It is perhaps during this meeting that Lincoln presents Colfax with a gift, a war trophy. The president gives Colfax the gavel that had been used by the Confederate Speaker of the House. Captured in the days when the Union took Richmond, Colfax treasured that artifact, and today, the gavel is held in the History Museum's permanent collection. Or maybe the gift was given the next evening, when Colfax is again with the president in the White House. The breadth of that conversation is a little less certain, likely a more social discussion than the political one of the day before. They can't talk too long, though. Lincoln and his wife are planning on seeing a play. The play is called Our American Cousin. It's at Ford's Theater. Lincoln invites Colfax to join them for the show. Colfax, regrettably, must decline. He is planning his trip to the West, and he'll head out early the next morning. Of course, he wouldn't get far. In his journal and letters from that time, Colfax described the news of Lincoln's assassination as the most staggering blow our nation has ever received. There is a lot we'll discuss in future episodes about the way Colfax would help carry and shape Lincoln's legacy during the coming decades, but for now let's stay in the halls of Congress, because Schuyler Colfax is still the Speaker of the House, and the next chapter of American politics is about to begin before anyone has even had a chance to catch their breath from the last one. That chapter begins with Andrew Johnson. Colfax had known Johnson for years. As vice president under Lincoln during his second term, Johnson had been a somewhat symbolic figure, selected mostly for political optics. A Southern Democrat loyal to the Union, Johnson was supposed to represent reconciliation. But from the start, Colfax didn't trust him. Johnson had a sharp temper and a stubborn streak. He had once described himself as a Moses to the black man, but when push came to shove, he believed more in states' rights than federal guarantees. In Colfax's eyes, Johnson seemed determined to undo much of what Congress had just fought so hard to achieve. While Johnson called for restoration, Colfax and his Republican colleagues doubled down on Reconstruction. Johnson wanted the Southern states back in the Union as quickly and painlessly as possible. He offered sweeping pardons to former Confederates and let Southern legislatures reconstitute themselves with minimal oversight. To Colfax, this wasn't healing. It was surrender. Southern leaders who had backed secession were returning to power, and worse, they were passing laws designed to keep black Americans in a state of de facto slavery. Those black codes outraged Colfax and many in Congress. The power struggle came quickly. Just months into Johnson's term, on March 4, 1865, the 39th Congress took its seat. It was ready for a fight. As Speaker of the House, Colfax once again found himself at the center of the storm. He worked closely with leaders like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner to oppose Johnson's lenient policies and craft a more aggressive vision of Reconstruction. Legislation poured out of Congress. They extended the Freedmen's Bureau. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, guaranteeing Black Americans the same legal protections as white citizens. Johnson vetoed them both, and both times Congress, with Colfax at the helm in the House, overrode him. It was a remarkable moment. Presidential vetoes were rarely overturned in American history. To override two in quick succession sent a clear message. Congress, not the White House, was going to lead Reconstruction. The confrontations kept coming. Congress proposed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. Johnson opposed it. Colfax backed it. The battle lines were drawn. And in the end, Colfax won. The 14th Amendment was not only unpopular with Johnson, it was also unpopular with Southern states, now waiting in line to rejoin the Union. It provided citizenship for anyone born in the United States. That meant African Americans, including all of those who had been enslaved just a few months earlier. In the end, Colfax wasn't just successful in forcing the 14th Amendment past Johnson, he also forced it upon the former Confederate states. Until they agreed to ratify the amendment, they would not be permitted representation in Congress. It was political hardball of the highest order, leveraging the South's desire for representation to force through a sweeping redefinition of American citizenship, and it worked. Despite the fierce backlash, especially from white supremacists and Johnson himself, who used every tool he could to stop it. The 14th Amendment became law not just through persuasion, but through power. It was clear by now that it was Colfax and the congressional Republicans, not President Johnson, who had that power. The 14th Amendment was officially proposed by Congress on June 13, 1866, but didn't become law until July 9, 1868. When South Carolina held its nose and ratified it. General Lew Wallace spoke most glowingly of Colfax during these times, saying, "If Abraham Lincoln earned immortality as the great emancipator, Schuyler Colfax should share the glory, for it was he who first moved to protect and assure the free man in his freedom." By the time the 40th Congress convened in 1867, Colfax had spent 2 full terms as Speaker, longer than any Republican before him. He had guided the House through war, peace, and now an increasingly bitter constitutional crisis. His tenure would culminate in one of the most explosive political showdowns in U.S. history, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. By early 1868, relations between Congress and President Andrew Johnson had completely broken down. For nearly 3 years, Johnson had tried to obstruct congressional reconstruction at every turn. He vetoed civil rights legislation. He attacked the Freedmen's Bureau. He delivered fiery speeches, accusing Republicans of trying to Africanize the South. At one point, he even went on a disastrous national speaking tour, the Swing Around the Circle, where he compared himself to Jesus Christ and heckled his political opponents by name. Schuyler Colfax had seen enough. In the House, Colfax had mostly let the radical Republicans take the lead on calls for Johnson's removal, but behind the scenes he worked diligently to hold the Republican coalition together. Colfax believed that if the nation was going to move forward, truly forward, it had to do so without a president actively working against equality and justice. The breaking point came with the Tenure of Office Act. Passed by Congress in 1867, the law was designed to limit Johnson's power to fire members of his cabinet without Senate approval. especially Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a staunch ally of the Republican Congress. Johnson, seeing it as an unconstitutional infringement on executive power, ignored it. In February 1868, he fired Stanton anyway. That was it. On February 24th, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Andrew Johnson for high crimes and misdemeanors. As Speaker, Colfax did not vote. Speakers typically refrain from doing so, but he presided over the proceedings with a steely sense of resolve. In public remarks afterward, he said that the House had acted to preserve the integrity of the Constitution and the safety of the Republic. The impeachment was historic, the first in American presidential history. But the trial in the Senate fell one vote short of conviction. Johnson remained in office, but his power was shattered. Reconstruction would move forward, not because of him, but in spite of him. And through it all, Colfax remained at the center of the storm. His time as Speaker of the House would come to an end soon enough. But let's not race too far ahead of ourselves, because it's worth revisiting again just how consequential Schuyler Colfax's time in the Speaker's chair really was. He watched over the end of the Civil War and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He shepherded the ratification of the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery and the 14th Amendment establishing birthright citizenship. Colfax was there for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the first federal law to affirm equal protection under the law. He watched over the Reconstruction Acts, which divided the South into military districts and laid out terms for readmission to the Union. He guided Congress through the readmission of Southern states under the new terms, each one required to draft a new constitution, enfranchise black men, and disavow the Confederacy. He presided over the first impeachment in the history of the United States. And then, just as his time as Speaker was nearing its end, Colfax played a crucial role in getting the 15th Amendment through Congress, guaranteeing African Americans the right to vote. The amendment was not a foregone conclusion, and didn't get through legislation until the third version was bargained. Colfax at the center of those conversations, too. Colfax coordinated with Senate allies like Charles Sumner and state-level party leaders to build momentum, knowing that time was short. Reconstruction governments in the South, which could help secure ratification, were already under siege. The window was closing. But thanks in part to Colfax's skillful leadership and unshakable belief in political equality, Congress proposed the amendment just weeks before he stepped down to become vice president. It was a high-stakes legislative victory that showed how fragile and how fiercely contested the promise of American democracy really was. By 1868, he had served 6 consecutive terms in Congress and 3 as Speaker of the House. He had been a steady, principled leader during the most turbulent years in American history, and then something remarkable happened. Schuyler Colfax, the most significant politician Northern Indiana had ever seen, and maybe the most significant politician it will ever see, began to hear whispers, quiet at first, then growing louder, that he might be destined for an even higher office, the one at the very top of the political ladder. Not bad for a newspaper man from South Bend, Indiana. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode will follow Schuyler Colfax during his travels out west, and we'll explore a little more about his politics. We're going to want to know this guy pretty well because soon enough, he'll be the Vice President of the United States. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.